My name is Julian Marsh. I am 36 years old, and I work as a senior data analyst at an urban infrastructure consultancy in Chicago, Illinois. The firm advises municipal governments on transit efficiency, population flow modeling, and the allocation of public resources across city systems. Work that is, in its daily practice, largely composed of spreadsheets and statistical models and presentations to people who have decision-making authority and varying degrees of patience for the methodology behind the conclusions. I have been at the firm for 8 years, having arrived from a graduate program in applied mathematics at Northwestern, with the conviction that cities were the most complex and interesting systems a person could spend their professional life studying, and having found, in the years since, no compelling reason to revise that conviction. I live in Andersonville, on the north side of the city, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Berwyn Avenue that I have occupied for 5 years, and that has accumulated, over those 5 years, the particular character of a space that belongs entirely to one person, books organized by subject, and then by author within subject, a kitchen that is genuinely used and shows it, a second bedroom that functions as an office, and contains a whiteboard that has not been fully erased in 3 years, because the diagram on the left side of it represents a transit flow model I am still refining. My commute to the office in the Loop is 42 minutes on the Red Line from Berwyn Station, which I have taken every working day for 5 years, with the consistency of someone who has calculated that it is 12 minutes faster than the bus and 8 minutes faster than cycling in all but optimal weather conditions. I tell you this by way of establishing that I am a person who pays attention to systems and to the patterns within them, and that this quality of attention is the reason I noticed her at all, and that noticing her changed the character of the 42 minutes considerably before I fully understood what was happening. My previous relationship had ended 14 months before this story begins. Her name was Priya. She was an urban planner at the city, and we had been together for 3 years, and the ending had come from a place that I have taken time to understand accurately, which is that I had been, throughout our relationship, more interested in the system of the relationship than the experience of it. I had been reliable and attentive in all the ways that could be measured and scheduled, and I had been less present in the ways that could not. Priya had described this, in the final conversation, as the feeling of being with someone who was always one degree of abstraction removed from what was actually happening, that I would analyze the pattern of a thing rather than simply be inside the thing. She was not wrong. I had known she was not wrong, and had spent the 14 months since in the particular project of understanding the difference between those two modes of being, which is easier to state as a distinction than to actually enact. The Red Line is a specific and consistent social environment, which is to say it is the same 42 people at the same time every morning with minor variation for illness and schedule changes, and within that environment, certain patterns establish themselves rapidly for anyone paying attention. The woman who reads a physical newspaper and folds it in thirds because the car is too crowded for full broadsheet. The man in the yellow jacket who falls asleep between Fullerton and Chicago and wakes himself with a small, dignified jolt at Grand. The two women who clearly work together and spend the ride reviewing something on a shared tablet and laughing at intervals with the easy frequency of people who are good at their jobs and know it. She boarded at Berwyn, same station as me. She appeared in the 3rd week of February on a Tuesday morning, which I know with this precision not because I was cataloging her arrival, but because I had a project deadline that week, and the date is associated in my memory with the work rather than with her. She was carrying a canvas tote from the Seminary Co-op bookshop on 57th Street, a navy coat that was not heavy enough for the February temperature, and a coffee from the Metropolis Coffee Company on Granville that she held with both hands in the specific way of someone for whom the warmth of the cup is as necessary as the caffeine. She had the focused, internal quality of someone who was already working, not on her phone, not on a device, simply thinking with the particular expression of someone whose morning cognitive work had begun before they left the house. The car was full. She stood. I was in an aisle seat because I had been at the station at 7:11, which was early enough to board before the Bryn Mawr crowd, and the window seat beside me was occupied by my bag, which was a habit I had not yet examined as a deliberate choice, but which functioned in practice as the preservation of space. She stood in the aisle for the duration of the ride, holding the overhead bar and the coffee simultaneously, And at one point the car lurched between Sheridan and Wilson and the coffee tilted, and she caught it with the calm reflexes of someone who had managed this before. I watched this, noted it, and at Burr 1 the following morning moved my bag to the floor before I sat down. She boarded. She saw the empty seat. She looked at it briefly with the assessing quality of someone who does not sit in strangers' seats on the train without establishing that the strangers intend the offer. I nodded once. She sat down. She held her coffee in both hands and looked forward, and neither of us said anything for 42 minutes, which was the correct social behavior for the red line at 7:15 in the morning, and which I found entirely comfortable. This continued for 4 weeks. She boarded at Burr 1 every morning, Tuesday through Friday, not Monday, which I noted without analysis, though the absence suggested either a remote work arrangement or a schedule that began differently at the start of the week. I moved my bag to the floor each morning. She sat. We did not speak. The social contract of the morning commute was observed with mutual fidelity. In the 4th week, she began bringing a notebook in addition to the coffee. Small, dark red cover, the Leuchtturm 1917 medium size in hardcover, which I recognized because I used the same brand in a different color for project notes. She wrote in it for portions of the ride with the focused, unhurried script of someone for whom handwriting was the natural medium of sustained thought. I did not read what she wrote. I was aware of the writing the way you are aware of anything that happens consistently in close proximity, which is to say it registered as a feature of the commute without requiring examination. On the 2nd Tuesday of March, she boarded and sat, and then, after approximately 4 minutes of the customary silence, turned and looked at me directly. "Why do you do that?" she said. I looked at her. "The seat," she said. "Every morning you keep it." I considered the question honestly for a moment. "You were standing the first day," I said. "The coffee nearly went over at Sheridan. It seemed sensible." She looked at me with an expression that was assessing rather than warm, the expression of someone who was evaluating whether the answer matched the pattern of behavior and had not yet decided. "Every morning," she said, "for a month." "The condition hasn't changed," I said. "The train is full at this hour. You board at this station. The seat is available." She continued looking at me for a moment. Then she said, "That is either the most practical or the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me on public transit." "Possibly both," I said. The corner of her mouth moved in the specific, contained way of someone who found something genuinely amusing and was not going to be excessive about it. She turned back to face forward and opened the Leuchtturm and wrote something, and I returned to the data on my phone, and the train continued to the loop. At Washington, she stood to exit and looked back briefly. "Thank you," she said, "for the month." "You're welcome," I said. She got off the train. I continued to Grand and walked to the office and spent the morning on a transit flow model that I was, for the first time in recent memory, finding difficult to focus on fully. Her name, which I did not know for another 2 weeks, was Nadia Osai. She boarded at Burr 1 every Tuesday through Friday morning because she taught a Tuesday-Thursday seminar at the University of Chicago and held office hours on Wednesdays and Fridays. And on Mondays, she worked from the apartment she kept in Andersonville, 4 blocks from mine, as it turned out. A fact that had the particular quality of an obvious thing that had been in front of you longer than you had been aware of it. She was 33 years old. She was an assistant professor of urban sociology at the University of Chicago, 2 years into a tenure-track position, studying the relationship between transit infrastructure and neighborhood economic mobility, which was, as she noted the first time we discussed it, the social science version of what I did with statistics. She had been at the university for 2 years, had moved to Andersonville because of its transit access and its walkability and its specific character as a neighborhood, and had been taking the Red Line to Hyde Park via connection at Lake since arriving. I learned this in pieces, over the 2 weeks following the morning she had asked the question, because after that morning something had changed in the social contract of the commute. Not dramatically, not with the awkwardness of a thing being forced, but with the natural shift that occurs when 2 people who have been in acknowledged proximity decide, by mutual and unspoken agreement, that conversation is now available. We talked in the way of morning commuters who have discovered a shared frequency, briefly, in the intervals between stations, about the things that were naturally present, the transit modeling I was working on. The seminar she was teaching on residential segregation and transit access, which was a subject she described with the particular animation of someone who had found the precise intersection of their intellectual interest and their sense of what mattered, and who was not going to apologize for the fact that those 2 things were the same. She was precise and unhurried in conversation. which I found more comfortable than the social mode that fills every available silence. She did not ask questions she was not genuinely interested in answering. She did not offer information she had not considered. When she disagreed with something I said, she said so directly and with the specific grounds for the disagreement, which required me to have actual positions rather than managed neutrality, and which I found, to my own surprise, clarifying rather than challenging. She also noticed things. Not in the abstract analytical way I noticed things, the pattern, the aggregate, but in the particular, immediate way of someone who was attending to the specific texture of what was in front of them. She noticed that the woman with the newspaper had changed her boarding car and now boarded 2 doors down, which had altered her folding pattern because this car had a slightly different spatial configuration at rush hour. She noticed that the man in the yellow jacket had not been on the train for a week and a half and was back on a Wednesday wearing a slightly different yellow jacket, which she assessed as either a replacement or a laundering outcome. She told me these observations in the casual tone of someone who was not making a show of noticing, but who noticed as a natural mode of being in the world. I found this combination of qualities, the precision, the directness, the particular texture of her attention, difficult to stop thinking about after I left the train. This was new information about myself, and I sat with it with the honest attention it deserved. In the 4th week of March, I asked if she wanted to continue the conversation off the train. I said it in those terms because they were the accurate terms. The conversation we were having in 42-minute segments between Berwyn and wherever we each exited was a specific and good conversation, and I wanted more of it, and the direct way to say that was to say it. I had learned, from Priya and from the 14 months since, that the managed and indirect approach to wanting something was a form of avoidance that presented itself as consideration, and was neither. She looked at me with the assessing expression she applied to things she wanted to evaluate accurately. "Off the train," she said. "There's a coffee place on Clark," I said, "or wherever you prefer." "Intelligentsia on Broadway," she said. "Saturday morning, 9 o'clock." "Yes," I said. She wrote something in the Leuchtturm, then returned it to the tote bag and looked forward for the remainder of the ride. Saturday at 9 o'clock, I was at Intelligentsia on Broadway. She arrived at 9:02, which I noted was consistent with someone who ran a precise schedule and had been 2 minutes from the location when she left her apartment. She ordered a pour-over, the Ethiopia Yirgacheffe, which the barista described in terms she evaluated briefly and accepted, and we sat at the table by the window that looked out onto Broadway and talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was not a duration either of us had planned, and which neither of us addressed until we both needed to leave for the reasons our Saturday mornings contained. The conversation was different off the train. Not better or worse, different in the way that a longer sample size produces different information than a constrained one. On the train, we had been distilled by the format, specific, brief, the essential things surfacing because there was no room for the non-essential. In the coffee shop, we had space, and the space produced a fuller picture, which was exactly what I had wanted and which turned out to be, in every particular, more interesting than the constrained version. She had grown up in Accra, Ghana, had come to the United States for her undergraduate degree at MIT, had completed her doctorate at Columbia, and had arrived at Chicago with the specific set of professional priorities that tenure-track positions require, and the specific personal history of someone who had been building an intellectual life in a sequence of cities that were each complete in themselves, and none of which had been permanent. She talked about this with the honesty of someone who had examined it and was not obscuring its implications, that she had become skilled at the particular mode of provisional inhabitation that a life of academic appointments required, and that she was only beginning to understand, 2 years into a position she intended to stay in, what it meant to inhabit a place as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. I told her about the whiteboard in the 2nd bedroom, about the transit flow model that had been partially on it for 3 years, about the way I had organized my professional and personal life around the study of how people moved through cities, and had not, for a long time, examined the irony that my own movement through my own life had been managed and careful in the ways that Priya had eventually named accurately. She looked at me when I said this with the expression of genuine attention rather than performed sympathy. "What changed?" she said. 14 months of honest assessment, I said, and a question on a train that required a real answer. She looked at me for a moment. "The seat question," she said. "It made me look at a habit I had not examined," I said. "The bag on the seat. I had been doing it for 5 years, a form of maintained space. The habit of preserving room around yourself as though the alternative were a loss rather than a possibility. She held the coffee cup in both hands in the way she did on the train. The gesture that I had come to understand was not cold seeking but grounding, a physical anchor for sustained thought. I know that habit, she said. Mine is different in form, but I recognize the function, provisional inhabitation, never quite unpacking, staying ready to move on the grounds that permanence carries the risk of loss and mobility carries the illusion of control. And the notebook, I said. She looked at the luchtum on the table between us. Some things are safer on the page than in the room, she said. I have been keeping that kind of notebook since I was 17. It is useful and also, I have come to understand, a way of processing the interior experience of a thing rather than being fully inside the thing itself. We looked at each other across the table for a moment with the particular quality of recognition that arrives when two people who have been examining the same problem from different angles find themselves at the same position. One degree of abstraction removed, I said, Priya's phrase. Yes, she said, exactly that. Her wound was not hidden. It was simply organized. She carried it with the practical efficiency of someone who had made peace with a thing by categorizing it correctly, which is a form of management that looks like resolution, and is, under examination, something that still requires the underlying condition to be addressed. Her father had died when she was 24, in the middle of her first year of doctoral work at Columbia. He had been 56, a sudden cardiac event, and the geography of the loss, she had been in New York. He had been in Accra, and she had not been there, had compounded the grief in the specific way that distance compounds grief, by adding the weight of the uncrossable interval to the weight of the loss itself. She had, in the years since, organized her life around a mobility that was partly intellectual ambition, and partly, she had come to understand, the avoidance of the particular vulnerability that comes from putting your roots deep enough that their severing would cost you in the way her father's death had cost her. Each city had been complete, and then vacated. Each position had been a tenure on the way to the next. Each relationship had been inhabited with the provisional quality of someone who was not going to stay long enough to make the leaving catastrophic. She told me this on a Saturday evening in April. We were at my apartment. She had brought a bottle of Manklang orange wine from the wine shop on Clark because she had been told the shop was good, and she made decisions about these things from information rather than from habit. And she told it in the flat, considered way she told things she had processed sufficiently to report without being undone by the reporting. The Chicago position is different, she said. I came here with the intention to stay. The work is the right work for the long term. I bought a bed frame rather than keeping the one from the previous apartment, which sounds minimal but was not, for me, a minimal decision. A permanent bed frame is a commitment to place, I said. You can understand that as someone who has a 3-year transit model on his whiteboard, she said. Yes, I said. I can. She looked at her wine glass. The part I am still working on, she said, is whether the intention to stay in a place translates to the willingness to stay inside things, relationships specifically. I have been mobile there in the same way, close enough to be genuine but with the departure always understood as available. The next city as the implicit reset. She paused. I do not have a next city anymore, which means the mobility I used as a management strategy is no longer structurally available. What does that require of you? I said. She looked at me with the direct, unhurried quality. Staying when it becomes expensive, she said. Being inside the thing rather than on the page, not keeping the departure available as a default. And, I said, and telling you that I am aware of the pattern, she said, so that when it activates, which it will, you are not encountering it without context. So that the pattern is named between us, and is therefore something we can address rather than something I manage privately. I set down my glass. Nadia, I said, yes. I had a 3-year relationship with someone I loved who told me at the end that I was always 1 degree of abstraction removed from what was actually happening, I said. I have spent 14 months understanding what she meant. I am not going to be the person who is relieved by your management of your own distance. I am going to be the person who asks you to stay in the room. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not breaking, which was not her mode, but releasing, the specific quality of a structure that has been correctly loaded and has settled. I know, she said. That is why I am telling you now rather than later. The months that followed were the deliberate construction of 2 people who had each spent significant time understanding the patterns they needed to change, and were applying that understanding in real conditions, which is different from applying it in theory and harder in the specific ways that real conditions are harder than theoretical ones. She was not always inside the room. There were evenings when she went to the notebook rather than the conversation, and I had learned to recognize the difference between the notebook as processing tool, which was legitimate and hers, and the notebook as the one degree of abstraction removal, which was the pattern. When the second was operating, I said her name in the specific way I had learned she heard as an invitation back rather than a demand, and she came back, with the particular grace of someone who had decided that being called back was something she could accept rather than something she had to preempt by not leaving. I was not always fully present. There were occasions when I was analyzing the pattern of an evening rather than being inside the evening, when the data analyst's tendency to model a situation rather than inhabit it asserted itself in ways that were subtle, and when Nadia named them accurate. She named them without heat and without the particular impatience of someone who was cataloging failures. She named them the way she named anything she had observed precisely, which was as information that was useful for addressing the condition. I received them in the same spirit and adjusted accordingly, which was the correct response, and also a thing I was learning to do with more consistency than I had managed with Priya. We talked about the work in the sustained, genuine way of two people whose professional lives were substantively related, and who found the intersection of those lives interesting rather than competitive. She was studying the relationship between transit access and economic mobility in Chicago neighborhoods, which was, from a different disciplinary angle, exactly what my firm's transit efficiency models were designed to inform. We had conversations about methodology that were professionally useful to both of us, and that had the additional quality of being among the most engaging conversations I had in any context, because she brought to the data the social texture that my models abstracted away, and I brought to the social analysis the structural precision that her qualitative work sometimes required grounding in. She presented a paper at a conference in June. Urban Sociology, a large annual gathering, several hundred attendees. She had been working on the paper for 8 months. It was about the distributional effects of red line service disruptions on hourly workers in Northside neighborhoods, which was a subject she cared about with the specific, grounded passion of someone who understood that transit systems were not abstractions, but the daily infrastructure of people's economic lives. She had been preparing the presentation for 3 weeks and had rehearsed sections of it at my kitchen table on 2 occasions, not for feedback, but because she thought out loud better when there was a person in the room rather than a wall. The morning of the conference, she was at her own apartment getting ready, and I texted her the one thing that seemed accurate to say, which was, "The work is correct. The room will know it." She texted back 40 minutes later from the conference venue. They knew it. That evening we had dinner at a restaurant on Damon that she had been wanting to try for 2 months, an Ethiopian place that had the specific quality of cooking that is the memory of another table, another country, and that she ate with a quietness that was not sadness but something more complicated and more honest. She talked about her father over dinner, about the meals in Accra, about the specific dish her mother made on Sundays that she had been trying to recreate in her own kitchen for 9 years without fully getting there, which she described as a pleasant and permanent failure she had made peace with. I did not offer comfort. I listened, which was what the conversation required, and when she finished, I said that I would very much like to try her version of the dish sometime, which was the accurate response because it was true, and because it implied a future in which she was cooking in her kitchen and I was present, and she heard it that way and looked at me briefly with the expression that was her equivalent of the thing other people expressed with more visible warmth. "You're getting better at being in the room," she said. "You're getting better at staying in it," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I am." 8 months after the morning she had asked the question on the red line, she submitted a grant application for a 2-year research project on transit equity in Chicago that, if funded, would be the largest project of her career to date and would constitute the primary evidence base for the tenure case she would need to make in 3 years. She had been working on the application for 6 months. It was substantial work: a full research design, a budget justification, a literature review, a methodology section that she had revised 4 times to the standard she required. She submitted it on a Thursday morning in October. She texted me a single word at 11:43, "Done." I was in a client meeting. I looked at the text under the conference table with the specific quality of attention that belongs to things that are more important than the thing you are nominally attending to. I texted back, "Come to dinner tonight. I'll cook." She arrived at 7:15 with the luchdom and the navy coat and nothing else. She sat at my kitchen table and opened the notebook and wrote for 20 minutes while I finished cooking, which was the particular and comfortable arrangement of two people who had learned to be in the same room without requiring the room to be structured around their togetherness. She was processing the end of the application period, the specific decompression of completing something that had been consuming for 6 months, and the notebook was the correct instrument for that processing, and I understood this, and gave her the 20 minutes without ceremony. We ate. She told me about the final revisions, the section she had been uncertain about until 48 hours before submission, and that she had resolved through the specific method of stopping trying to resolve it and walking to the lake at 6 in the morning and returning with the answer already assembled. I told her about the client presentation that afternoon, the pushback on the modeling assumptions from a transit authority commissioner who had political reasons for not accepting the conclusions the model supported, and the specific professional difficulty of maintaining the integrity of the analysis under that pressure. She listened to this with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered to her, and then said, with the precise and unhedged directness that was entirely her, "The model is right and the commissioner knows it. Present it again at the next meeting with the sensitivity analysis included. Take away the interpretive room." She was right. I made a note. After dinner, she sat on the couch and I sat beside her, and she opened the notebook and then closed it and set it on the table rather than on her lap, which was a small thing and a thing I noted as significant, the notebook available but not between us. "I want to tell you something," she said. I waited. "I have been in this city for 2 years, and I have been, in the full sense of what I described in April, inhabiting it rather than moving through it. The work is permanent. The apartment is permanent. The bed frame is permanent." She paused. "And this," she gestured between us with the economy of someone who uses physical language precisely, "is the thing I have not previously been willing to make permanent, and I want you to know that I understand the difference between my historical pattern and what I am choosing here, and that I am choosing it with full awareness of both." I looked at her for a long moment. "Nadia," I said. "Yes." "You boarded at Berwyn in February with a coffee that nearly went over at Sheridan," I said. "And I moved my bag to the floor and did not examine whether that was a significant decision until you asked me about it a month later. I have been a person who moved his bag to the floor as a reflex without understanding that the reflex was the truest thing about me, that I was capable of making room, consistently, and without requiring acknowledgement, and that I had simply not yet found the person for whom that capacity was the right response." I paused. "You are the person for whom it is the right response. I have known this for 8 months, and I am saying it now directly because that is what this requires." She looked at me with the full steadiness of her gaze. Something settled in her face, not dramatically, in the way of things that have been building to the correct moment and have arrived there without fanfare. "The question I asked on the train," she said. "Yes," I said. "I knew the answer before I asked it," she said. "I had been watching you move the bag for a month. I asked because I wanted to hear you say it out loud in your own words, and because I had written about it in the notebook 6 times and I was tired of the notebook having it and the room not having it." "What did you write?" I said. She picked up the Leuchtturm, opened it to a page in early March. "Read. He moves the bag every morning. No acknowledgement required, no reciprocal obligation performed. The action is simply present. I do not know what to do with a person who makes room as a reflex rather than a calculation." She closed the notebook. "Now you know what to do with it," I said. "Yes," she said. "I do." The story does not end at a particular landmark, which is the honest way of stories that are still in progress. It ends on a Tuesday morning in November, 10 months after the first morning she had sat in the seat I kept, when we boarded the Red Line at Berwyn together because she had stayed the previous night, and we were walking to the station from the same direction. The car was full in the usual way of 7:15 on the Red Line. We found 2 seats together in the middle of the car, actually together, both seats available, the ordinary fortune of an ordinary morning. She sat and opened the Leuchtturm and wrote something brief and returned it to the tote bag. I reviewed the data on my phone. The train moved south through the North Side neighborhoods, through Sheridan and Wilson, and the stations that constituted the daily geography of the commute, through the architecture of a system I had spent 8 years studying, and that I was still, every morning, finding interesting in new ways. At Wilson, the man in the yellow jacket boarded. Slightly different yellow jacket than the summer version, a heavier one, November requiring it. He found a seat 2 rows up and arranged himself in the familiar way and looked forward with the settled expression of someone inside their routine. Nadia looked at him, looked at me, a brief, contained amusement in her expression. "He has a heavier version for November," she said quietly. "I see that," I said. She returned to looking forward. Her shoulder was against mine in the particular way of a crowded train car, not as a gesture, simply as a fact of the available space, comfortable and uncalculated. Outside the window, the north side moved past in the gray November light, the apartments and storefronts, and the infrastructure of a city that 2 million people moved through every day in the systems that I modeled and she studied, and that we were, on this Tuesday morning, simply inside. I thought about the bag on the seat. About the 5 years of a preserved space that I had not examined as a significant habit, until a direct question on a crowded train had required a direct answer. About the particular and unpredicted route from a reflex to a question to a conversation to the present moment, which was unremarkable in all the ways that the present moments of lives being built are unremarkable, and which was, in that unremarkableness, exactly right. She took her coffee from the tote bag, still Metropolis, still held in both hands, and settled into the seat for the remaining stations, and did not look at her phone and did not write in the notebook. She was simply there, in the full and unreserved way of someone who has stopped keeping the departure available as a default. And I was beside her in the specific and present way of someone who has learned that being inside the thing is the correct position, and that making room, consistently, and without requiring acknowledgement, is not a habit to be examined, but a quality to be understood as the truest available expression of who you are. The train continued south through the city that we both studied and both inhabited, through the transit system that connected neighborhoods and histories and the daily economic lives of 2 million people, through the infrastructure that was, as she had once described it in the context I understood best, not an abstraction, but the living system in which the actual texture of a city's life moved and was shaped and revealed itself to those who paid the correct quality of attention. We paid attention. We were inside the thing. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, everything. The right person does not always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply appear in the same car on the same morning at the same station and stand for 42 minutes holding a coffee that nearly goes over at Sheridan. And you move your bag to the floor, and neither of you says anything. And this happens for a month until she turns and asks you directly why you do that. And you give her the honest answer, and the honest answer turns out to be the beginning of everything that follows. You do not need a dramatic entrance or a declared intention. You need only the reflex that makes room without calculation, the question that requires an answer given in your own words, and two people willing to stop managing the distance and simply be inside the same room, on the same train, in the same city, moving together through the infrastructure of an ordinary and fully inhabited life.